Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, Episode 19. I am your host, Stephanie Corey, filling in for the late Richard Behrens, author of the Lizzie Borden Girl Detective series of mysteries. In this episode, we interview Karen Roggenkamp, professor of American Literature and Children's Literature at Texas A&M University Commerce. She's the author of two books, Narrating the News, New Journalism and Literary Genre in Late 19th Century American Newspapers and Fiction, and Sympathy, Madness, and Crime, How Four 19th Century Journalists Made the Newspaper Woman's Business, both published by Kent State University Press. Each book, in part, highlights the Lizzie Borden case through the lens of two renowned journalists, Julian Ralph and Elizabeth Jordan. The Lizzie Borden Podcast is the only podcast entirely devoted to the study of the Borden murders of 1892, Lizzie Borden, and sometimes the history of her hometown, Fall River, Massachusetts. Produced by Nine Muses Books and Anna Behrens. Each episode explores some aspect of the mystery that is Lizzie Borden, from the origins of the doggerel Lizzie Borden Took an Axe, to a primer on the case by noted authors and experts, including dramatic readings of Richard Behrens' Lizzie Borden Girl Detective Mystery Series. Please subscribe to us on YouTube so we can meet the magic number they have set for us to be able to remove advertisements, which we see no revenue from. And now, the Lizzie Borden Podcast presents an interview with Karen Roggenkamp. Karen Roggenkamp is a professor of English at Texas A&M University Commerce, where she teaches classes in American literature and children's literature. Lizzie Borden has featured in both of her books, Narrating the News, New Journalism and Literary Genre in Late 19th Century American Newspapers and Fiction, and Sympathy, Madness, and Crime, How Four 19th Century Journalists Made the Newspaper Woman's Business, both published by Kent State University Press. Karen's fascination with Lizzie Borden began in earnest when a college housemate informed everyone that Borden was a member of his family tree, which gave them all something to think about at night. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you very much.
So that's an interesting story.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe that's what started my track of thinking more carefully about Lizzie Borden, at least in the back of my mind. Of course, at least if you're of a certain generation, you grow up knowing about the doggerel, the jumping rope rhyme, but I think that got my thought process going in terms of this fascinating case.
Because after all, she's a real person. She's not a caricature or a fictional construct. She's actually was a real person. So as a real historical figure, we have a responsibility to be careful in how we depict her, so as not to, through history, defame or malign her character when we don't have the evidence to support it. That's always been my thing, especially with the victims. I'm getting off on a tangent now, but I think the victims are made to be sinister and deserving.
And that is, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
That is one of the amazing things about it is, yes, she was a real historical character. People died horrible deaths. And yet, over the years, she has become a fictionalized, crafted, reassembled kind of figure that makes for a really complicated picture of, what is she doing? How are people using her? And I think that's where my academic interest comes in. I would still love someday to write a book just about Lizzie Borden and the uses and abuses of this case in popular culture, in literary culture. Some people have done some work with that, but new artifacts just keep coming and coming. And I find that fascinating.
I know, she's like in the water supply is the way, she's around us always. There's references to her all over the place.
Absolutely.
And so there she is again. Well,
exactly. I have a t-shirt that has it's Hello Kitty dressed in sort of with the hair of one of the more famous photographs of Lizzie Borden and a little, what is it?
Pansies, the pansy
Yeah,
thing?
pansy pin, and it's labeled Kitty Borden, and has a bloody axe on it and everything.
Oh my
I mean, when
goodness.
you have Kitty, Hello Kitty meeting up with Lizzie Borden, you're at a whole new level of
Exactly.
influence.
Yeah, she's everywhere. She's everywhere, like Chicken Man.
Yeah.
Well, you've written two books on journalism in the 19th century, and both books use as your study the Borden case. So you talk about the Borden case through the lens of the newspaper journalists of the 19th century. So why Lizzie? What about Lizzie and this case made it important for you or intrigued you enough to spend some time examining it twice?
Well, that's a really wonderful question and a complex question. I think on one level, there's just the sheer fascination I have with one of the great unsolved mysteries. And that is fundamentally what it is. People have opinions about, oh, she did it, she didn't do it, it was this person. We'll never know. I think it's highly unlikely we will ever know definitively what happened on that day in Fall River. But aside from my fascination with the case, I'm also fascinated by how she was constructed for popular consumption at the time of the murders and the trial, and that we get through the journalists of the time. How did they write Lizzie into existence? What kind of variations were there in the way journalists framed her, to think of it that way, the way they constructed motives for her or emphasized certain things over other things in order to sway public opinion or to kind of sometimes make a larger point socially that they wanted to make. And then, as I suggested, I'm fascinated also about how the story lives on, principally in literary reproductions and rewritings of the case, how the story gets twisted and used. It's almost like the Lizzie Borden case becomes a receptacle for all sorts of different social commentary that people might want to make, or artistic expressions, or using opera to explore her motives, or film. How many more Lizzie Borden films can we have? They just keep coming out. And, sort of like the equivalent in England, the Jack the Ripper case, which was just a few years earlier, it's not just finally about Lizzie Borden in terms of American culture. It's more like Lizzie Borden speaks to anxieties, or it's through Lizzie Borden, an exploration of Lizzie Borden, that throughout the decades, American artists and, popular audiences have maybe tried to address and work out some of their worries and
Anxieties, maybe?
anxieties, yes, about a changing culture, women's place in it, and other social issues.
Can you imagine how she would feel having all of that on her back?
Given what I know of her personality, how very private she was, how she didn't want the limelight in any way, and who can blame her? She would be horrified, or maybe she'd be fascinated and just thrilled by it. Who knows?
Right. We don't even know what she sounded like. So
We don't, absolutely. And, there is that theatrical side of Lizzie and her fascination. We know from her, interest in the theater after the death of her father and stepmother. Maybe she would just luxuriate in it. It's impossible to know.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I notice in your books, you don't use the term yellow journalism. I don't think it appears at all. But instead, you use the term new journalism, which you say is a term coined by Matthew Arnold in, I think, 1887 to describe the narrative journalism of the era. Is there a reason why you do this, or is it a conceit of your scholarship? Meaning, is this the correct term we should be using, and why?
It actually is, although I think yellow journalism is more of new journalism on a seriously high dose of steroids that are doing as much damage to journalism as they can to the human body. So new journalism is what practitioners, cultural critics of the late 19th century called this style of journalism. Often Pulitzer is pointed to as the originator of a new kind of journalism. I think that's a bit of an overstatement, but Joseph Pulitzer, first with his papers in St. Louis, was really striving for a narrative style that married the dramatic tools of fiction writing, vivid storytelling, development of plot lines, clear setting, dialogue, character building, used those techniques in order to tell a journalistic story, a fact-based story. And we think of that term new journalism as something associated with the writing, for instance, of Truman Capote and others of the time. Their coinage of the term new journalism in that era is ahistorical in some sense, because it had already existed. And in the late 19th century, and then even earlier in the 19th century, the 1830s and 40s with the penny press. So we might almost say that the new journalism of late 19th century was bringing back to life some styles of journalism that had been popular several decades earlier. And then the same thing happened again in the late, middle to late 20th century with magazine writing by Capote and others. But new journalism was the term that was used. Now, yellow journalism is still kind of a distinct thing. It's just the new journalism run amok, new journalism that becomes completely devoid of sometimes ethics, balance. It becomes tabloid. There's some contest in terms of when does who termed new journalism, but often people think of the competition between Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst in the last decades of the 19th century, the last half decade, really. They both had comic papers that featured yellow-clad, kind of impish kids and yellow kid journalism. And those two papers embodied the worst of the worst by 1895 through the end of the century in terms of sensationalism and thoughtlessness, and competing with each other to outpace each other in terms of sensational writing and screaming headlines. So the yellowness of the characters in their comics comes to symbolize that style of completely over-the-top journalism, new journalism that's just out of control.
Is it kind of like National Enquirer stuff that we would have today? So
by
full of gossip and innuendo and
Yes.
somebody thought or somebody said, as opposed to factual information.
Absolutely. So the new journalism that was being produced at the time of the Lizzie Borden coverage is not the same as what we see in 1895, 1897. It's completely overboard by then.
And it's actually entertaining. It's actually good to read. It's actually meaty and interesting and has all that narrative structure and narrative content that you're looking for in a really good essay.
Yeah.
Oddly finding it in a newspaper back then, but that was the way they wrote back then, right? That was it. And nowadays it's also who, what, where, when, how, and they don't insert themselves into the story. Whereas we'll talk about in a little bit, people that actually did insert themselves into the stories back then.
And I will put a finer point on that by saying that the new journalistic style certainly did not appear in all newspapers. There were still very somber newspapers, ones that were much more devoted to economic interests. The New York Post, nowadays you don't think of the New York Post as being a serious.
But that's because who owns it?
Exactly. But back in 1893, it was very somber. Similarly, just as a side note, Cosmopolitan magazine, until it was owned by William Randolph Hearst, it was a very respectable magazine. Hearst bought it, and bit by bit, it turned into the Cosmo of today, right? So ownership of a publication really does matter hugely.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's interesting. So the Lizzie Borden trial commanded national attention. On a side note, New York Times didn't send anybody Were they one of the newspapers that you're talking about that was somber?
It was, although in 1893, I would have to go back and refresh myself. It was a faltering newspaper.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought.
Yeah, it's not until Adolph Oakes buys it, and I want to say that's a couple of years later
Okay.
that he starts to make it a powerhouse and a newspaper that is placed in opposition to the out of control journalism of Hearst and Pulitzer at that time.
That answers my question exactly. Thank you.
Mhm.
Elizabeth Jordan, actually, who was there, says that there were, in my notes, she said there were 33 journalists there, but I've read reports that there were 70 reporters at the trial, and with a special section in the courtroom reserved for the press. Now, there's no way 70 people could have fit in that section, so I'm going with her 33 number there. Newspapers from Fall River, New Bedford, Providence, Taunton, Boston, and New York were present every day, and each offered their readers a day-by-day blow of events. You concentrate between your two books on two New York journalists when discussing the Borden case. Julian Ralph from the New York Sun, whose editor was Charles Dana, and one woman, Elizabeth Jordan from the New York World, whose editor was Joseph Pulitzer, who mentioned before. How did you think that these two people, one man, one woman, differed in their reporting? And did their gender offer any insights that could be made only because they were different gendered?
Those two are interesting because they are not examples necessarily of people who are dramatically different. Julian Ralph was a very, very careful reporter, as was Elizabeth Jordan, I would say. They both took sympathetic views of Lizzie Borden, although I think, in my estimation, Elizabeth Jordan was not as open in her sympathetic views. She was very careful to kind of ask.
She played both questions.
Absolutely.
She's either this fiend, this horrible, crazy, mad, bloodthirsty fiend, or she's this sad, put upon martyr who's being accused of murdering her parents. I mean, there was no middle ground for her.
Right, absolutely. And Ralph does something of the same, but it's easier for me to read Ralph as more, clearly you can see where his sympathies lie. And that was acceptable for the time. Given the news standards, the audience expectations of the time, it wouldn't have been outrageous or a crime against journalism for a reporter to have obvious sympathies. Now, other journalists were not necessarily as sympathetic. And for her part, Elizabeth Jordan kind of envisions herself as a female writer who is unlike other writers who are condemning of Lizzie Borden. Julian Ralph frames it a little differently. He plays hard on the trope of the Puritan wrongly accused. So here we are in Massachusetts 200 years after the Salem witch trial, and he leans into that image hard. He casts Lizzie Borden as this old maid. She was, what, 32?
Yeah.
Hardly, from our perspective, an old maid, but in her time, clearly considered a spinster, right? And so he creates her as this old maid character, but not a scary old maid, right? Rather an old maid that deserves our sympathy. She's been put in this genteel family with nothing to do, and she's kind of caught between these forces Julian Ralph sort of envisions of a father who's not allowing her the freedom she wants, and yet, she wants to break free, and now she's got all these people accusing her, and a crowd in the courtroom that is clearly condemning her. And both Jordan and Ralph pay a lot of attention to women in the courtroom who are clearly anti-Lizzie, openly antagonistic, and that bothers both of them. They just treat it in slightly different ways.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense to me. Another famous journalist was Joe Howard. He was there from the Boston Globe, but he was a freelancer for the Globe. And I remember his reporting as distinctive in that he had a byline, which was quite unusual, which was his signature that they printed in the newspaper. Unique, to be sure. Why do you think these papers sent their best to the trial? Like, it was a collection of all-stars. They wanted the best journalists that they had on staff to go to New Bedford to cover this case.
Without a doubt. This was the trial of the century, at least the trial of the era, and maybe the closest thing America had at that time to the Jack the Ripper frenzy and questioning about it. It was a huge deal. Papers sent entourages to New Bedford. I forget how many people came from the World alone. Elizabeth Jordan probably had, if you look in the World, there's articles that seem to be hers, fairly certain they're hers, though they don't have a byline. For various reasons, we can track that. But there's other shorter articles that are sort of recap articles. So there was at least another journalist there writing those. Illustrators went with her. There were special telegraph rooms set up, extra telegraph capabilities, so reporters can get it sent back to their respective cities. The founder of the Reuters news agency made sure that wires could get over quickly to Europe. This case has always stood out, even in its own time, as being something so beyond expectation. Readers really across the country and even beyond were captivated. And I think Borden herself was the cause of a lot of that. She didn't speak for herself. People described her as extremely stoic, inscrutable. Both the journalists that I look at, Elizabeth Jordan and Julian Ralph, talk about just how inscrutable her eyes are, how they can't read her expression, how there's this mystery of who is this woman, not only what happened, but who is this woman? And so there's a real national drive, I think, you see it in the journalism, to try to figure out the mystery of Borden herself, not just the mystery of what happened in Fall River.
It's so weird. It's like if they hadn't sent all these people there, would we even know about it like we do now in terms of the sensationalism of the trial? Of course, women had been killing people since the dawn of civilization. And certainly in New York, it was not a completely unknown situation. Was it the death penalty, do you think? Was it the possibility of, or was it Massachusetts? I mean, was it that what you called the Puritan ethos here, where Massachusetts is coming out of this sort of 100-year malaise from the Salem witch trials, and actually putting people to death that were innocent, where no witchcraft existed, and taking that on as its reputation. And then here's a woman again accused, and what are they going to do in that town? What are they going to do in New Bedford, Massachusetts about this woman? And if she's convicted, she is hung.
I think it could be elements of those, but I also think, along with other scholars, that maybe the biggest factor in it was social class. So here's Borden coming from not a fancy family. They didn't live in the best part of Fall River, for instance. Maplecroft was something yet to come for Lizzie Borden, but clearly they had wealth. She was genteel. She was from an old family, a well-established family, and women in that social class just weren't thought of as people who could possibly commit these types of murders. Now, of course, that's not true, but that tells us everything about gender expectations and, intersections with social class. So if we say, yes, she did it, or if we presume that, then it might be the case that she got off because of her social class. A lot of people, of course, have argued that. There's no way of knowing that for sure, But that's how audiences read her. That's how journalists, many of them, read her. There were some journalists who were outraged by their thinking that here she clearly did do this and it was her social class that got her off. How unfair is that? But I think for the vast majority of people in the moment, or, a lot of people in the moment, certainly the jury, they couldn't grapple with the thought that here's this woman who could be a member of my own family, right? What does that say if she could do this to her parents, her father and her stepmother? Whoa, I can't deal with the thought of that. That's what some scholars have argued.
Do you think that the Manchester murder, the Bertha Manchester murder, which happened right before the trial started and before the jury was selected, so they would have heard about it and read about it in the local newspapers, where Bertha Manchester was a young woman living in Fall River out on New Boston Road, and she was axed to death, and her body had been discovered. Now, this is before the man who later admitted that he had done the deed was arrested or determined. And so all these men had before they were sequestered was this information that there had been another murder in Fall River. Now, the jury didn't write books like they do now. The jury didn't, they got together every year and had parties and reminisced about their jury trials, yes, and presented Lizzie with a photograph of themselves, yes, that they had posed for. But they didn't really talk about their deliberations, which were very short. It seems that they went into it already knowing at that point, or they had been discussing it illegally amongst themselves where they weren't supposed to discuss it because they had been together for 12 days or so. But do you think that the Bertha Manchester murder, back to my original thought, may have played an influence on the idea of innocent until proven guilty, and that this was a part of that possibility that there was a killer out there?
That's fascinating. I've never really given it that much thought, but you have to think that those similarities would have seemed striking to them, so to speak. Although, refresh my memory, it does seem that the Bertha Manchester, that was an axe. That was
a heavy-duty
weapon,
axe, yes.
as opposed to a hatchet.
And the murder weapon was found in the room. He had left it there.
Right. It could have provided enough space for them to say, oh, we can't possibly, this can't be her. We can't, maybe there is another killer out there. It might have given them an extra level of comfort in saying,
yeah, then finding her not guilty. Yeah,
right.
Like, we can't take the risk because just in case. I wonder how they felt when they actually found the killer quite quickly, and while they were in sequestration, and that was over with, I think, pretty in short order.
Well, if they were sending her photographs every year, which I might have read at some point, but if I did, I didn't.
No, they sent her one photograph, but they would get together and they would have a reunion.
That's fascinating.
Every year. And in fact, the newspaper would say when a juror passed away.
Really?
Yes. And then the last juror that died made it to the newspaper. The last living juror of the Lizzie Borden trial died.
So they gained a kind of fame. I certainly do remember illustrations of the jurors as the trial was going on, running in the New York World and other papers. They're given character roles almost as the story is unfolding, and then that continues.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. I never thought about it till I was talking to you about it just now. In your book, the second book, Sympathy, Madness, and Crime, you talk about stunt journalist Nellie Bly. And it was especially interesting to me in her undercover work, where she pretended to be a thief and was sentenced to jail and exposed what it was like. This poor innocent girl being treated so badly because but she had tried to get herself into jail by claiming to be a thief. And then later, or another time, she feigned insanity in order to investigate the Blackwell Island Asylum, which had been a sort of a focus point for a lot of investigative journalism, where people would go and talk to people there and interview inmates. But she was the one who got herself committed and acted crazy in a very oh my gosh, her idea of what a crazy person is like. And then she successfully achieved repeating Jules Verne's fictional Phineas Fogg, going around the world in 80 days by beating him for what, 8 days? By 8 days? And there's so much to discuss about her, but what intrigues me most is the way that she became the subject of her story each time. And she seems like this model of modern woman in that regard. How is it all about her, the normal, honest young girl in these horrific places, attempting to create some kind of fictional event, recreating it and beating a fictional man at it? And I'm sure there's more to say, but what do you suppose her reaction would be to Lizzie Borden, and how might she have inserted herself into this narrative in some, I don't know, stunt journalist way? Is there because that sort of was done by the time the Borden trial came up, right?
It was really just getting going, I would say.
Okay.
It picks up in a major way. There are a couple of really great books about women's stunt journalism in the 1890s. I've given thought to how Bly would approach the Lizzie Borden case, and I think we actually have a good insight into how she would have approached it. I can tell you it would be extremely different than what Elizabeth Jordan did. Jordan and Bly crossed paths at the New York World. Bly had been there earlier than Elizabeth Jordan. Apparently had given Jordan, one of the very few female journalists on staff at that time, had given her a bit of a cold shoulder. And for her part, Jordan in her memoir says something to Bly like, oh, don't worry, I'm not on your turf. I'm going to do real journalism. Something of that matter, which is not an inaccurate description.
Touché. Yes.
There was a difference in how they approached their work. Nellie Bly was actually involved in another Lizzie murder case, that of Eliza Halliday, or an accused Lizzie, I should say. This woman was the widow, a number of times, the widow of men who went mysteriously missing. When she was arrested, there was the discovery of bodies of lodgers buried in the family barn, and others who had been grotesquely buried under the kitchen floor, including dismembered family members. Nellie Bly goes to visit Lizzie Halliday in jail twice. Halliday had refused visitors from other journalists coming to cover the case. Another inscrutable accused murderess. Nellie Bly gets an appointment with her, and the way she tells the story of Eliza Halliday is it all becomes about Nellie Bly, rather. Right. How does this woman make me feel? Oh, blood's running cold, terrifying, but I have to keep digging. She comes back again, and she acts almost like the way she writes about it. Here I am, the female Sherlock Holmes. Let me read you a quote from her newspaper writing about this. She is the most avaricious woman I ever met. And she turns to Halliday and says, Lizzie Halliday, do you know what I believe? I believe that you and you alone, unaided, killed your husband and this other woman and buried them. And she confronts her and says, you weren't insane. You're just a dirty murderer. And it completely different style of journalism.
Yeah.
And I can just envision her doing that in the Lizzie Borden case.
That's amazing. That's amazing. It's funny because I think a lot of people wanted that interview with Lizzie. And maybe if Nellie Bly had been there, she might have said yes, only because Nellie Bly was so famous, like more than Elizabeth Jordan, even though Elizabeth Jordan had been around a while and was respected. But goodness, Nellie Bly was a celebrity.
Yes. And the woman who did interview Lizzie Borden, in fact, Kate Swan McGuirk, also became a stunt journalist, likewise putting herself into all these impossible, there's hilarious stuff to read, like Nellie Bly rides an elephant, or Kate Swan also gets arrested or like ends up in a house of prostitution or an opium den. They put themselves into all sorts of stunt positions, all sorts of sensational, scary, dangerous moments, and then write about it. It's a whole genre that makes for some hilarious reading, I have
But
to
not
say.
to expose social ills.
No.
Not to have a cause, not to open our eyes about the injustices that are happening to these people that she's a part of now, whose fraternity she has joined, but to make us all excited by her victimization, her innocence, and her adventure.
Yeah, I differ from some other newspaper scholars, journalists, historians, who give, I think, more credence to Bly's social impact. If we talk about Nellie Bly for a minute, people will often look at her reporting on Blackwell's Island when she feigns insanity to get, committed. She wasn't the first person to have done that, but she does write about some of the bad conditions in Blackwell's Island asylum. But when you read it, that's not the main point that I get from her writing. Now, good things did come from it. There were at least supposedly some reforms. But when you compare her writing about Blackwell's to that of other journalists who covered it, it's of a different sort. It's a story about her adventures that people can easily consume. She gives sympathy to women who may have been locked up because, a relative doesn't like them or they were feeling sad. Those kinds of people are differentiated from the others that she calls maniacs, right? Probably people with schizophrenia or, manic episodes. And so there's no real sympathy for that lot of people. There is sympathy for people who are easier to identify with. So it's a very selective.
Women who are committed, like their husbands put them there because they're being uppity at home and having their own causes and being a modern woman, and women who are there because of prostitution, or women who are there because of their choices in their lifestyle. Not that there's anything mentally incapacitating about them, but that this place was full of all kinds of women who didn't need to be there, including Nellie Bly.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't see personally social reform as the motivating factor for writing journalism like that.
Well, to study for this interview, I reread most of Elizabeth Jordan's pieces in the New York World, and she's very minutely particular about Lizzie's face, Lizzie's shoes, Lizzie's clothing, Lizzie's demeanor, that fan, and how she held the fan, and what she did with the fan. And so she's like a laser focused on her appearance and talking about her complexion and the sallowness of it and how, but she also gives her credit for not being the manly character that she had been made out to be by other journalists, and how that people were amazed when Lizzie first came into the courtroom, how female she was. They expected sort of a lumberjacky kind of man woman coming in who was accused of this massively violent act. And yet she was petite enough and small enough and womanly enough in order to be perceived as female primarily. Whereas if she had been butch femme, if she had been a different look about her, the trial might have actually gone in an entirely different direction. But her appearance seemed to be of the utmost importance to Jordan. And she knew her reader would want to know. So she knew her reader would want to know the style of her dress, the style of her hair, the style of her hat, and her mannerisms, and her staring at her all the time. And you can just imagine Lizzie being stared at by this woman constantly as Elizabeth Jordan's writing her notes. And that's no wonder Lizzie hid behind her fan so much, because she's probably like smiling beneath it. I don't know. But if someone was staring at me all the time, I don't know. It's a remarkable recording of the appearance of Lizzie that we don't have
Absolutely.
otherwise. She really, really detailed it for us.
You're right. And I would say that of the journalists that I've looked at, and certainly those that I've written about, that was just the reading of Lizzie Borden, right?
Mhm.
What's this tale? I think Jordan goes into it with more detail.
Mhm.
She has more of an eye, perhaps, as a woman, to thinking about, what do the soles of her shoes look like?
Mhm.
What can we say about this and that? But there was such scrutiny of the body of Lizzie Borden as she sat in that courtroom. And when, one day she faints, oh my goodness, the reporters go crazy with that. They're reading her body as a way to sort of try to decipher what is going on in that mind of hers.
Mhm.
What is happening? What are we going to see of the day? And there's so many articles that describe her appearance in relation to how the day unfolded. So they're writing at the end of a trial day. And of course, you've got tons and tons of just straight transcripts. Robinson said this, Knowlton said that. But those kinds of transcripts are framed by Lizzie appeared this way today, and that was symbolic of how the testimony went today. It's just a fascinating use of their construction of her, again, as a character in this terrible story that she's having to live through, as a barometer to try to understand these bigger issues that are at play.
And this is before photography makes its way into the newspaper, where there's still sketch artists and most excellent sketch artists, but there's also artists that take the photograph that had been taken and then do a line drawing, which is like it seems like almost an engraving
Yes.
that's used. The Boston Globe was must have had a photographer there, and their artist was amazing, the way they created these very highly detailed imagery, as well as the courtroom sketch artist, which is kind of caricatures of people and what they saw there. But without a photograph of her being published in the newspaper, because I guess that technology didn't exist yet.
Yeah, it was developing.
Her description paints a very vivid image of Lizzie moment by moment and event by event, so that we are sitting beside her during the trial. We are not the jury. We are not the judge. We are Lizzie. And we're watching the proceedings from her point of view almost always.
There's fascinating levels of watching going on. We as readers are watching the reporter, watching Lizzie, but the minuteness of the description of Lizzie is almost enough to let us see through her eyes, or at least, speculate. What is she seeing? Does she see these eyes on the back of her head? Julian Ralph sat like right behind her, just to the side. So he's like, she's right there. His eyes are boring into her. There's a fascination in the drawings, the court drawings that are published in these papers, a fascination with the people in the courtroom, not just Lizzie Borden, not just the defense attorneys, the prosecutor, and the jury, but you have several drawings of, here are the newspapermen,
Right.
a couple of women.
Mary Livermore is drawn. Mary Livermore, who was a social activist and suffragette, was there supporting Lizzie.
Right, because she became a cause célèbre for various women.
They latched onto her very fast.
They sure did. I've got an article about that in a book about crime narrative. So again, she becomes this vessel into which people can use her for promoting their own kinds of interests. But the layers of watching that you get, the watching of the women who are there every day to just gossip about her and condemn her, it's almost meta in its voyeurism, shall we say.
Is it Julian Ralph who talks about the women having nothing else to do, that they line up and come inside, or was it Elizabeth Jordan?
I think they both do talk about this group of women, which is fascinating to me. I want to know more about that group of women. I can't remember if they identify if these women are New Bedford women or Fall River women. Certainly we know that Fall River is the community that turns on Lizzie
When she
quickly
comes back
afterward.
home, yeah.
Mhm. So
Well, New Bedford by train, you'd have to take a train to get there. And
mhm.
that's, I can imagine them being New Bedford people, unless they've come to stay for the length of the trial. But who knew there were groupies back then? Who knew there were trial groupies back then? It seems like that's what they are.
It does seem that way. Yes.
But they're like that now. And they are like interviewed like today with all those people where they announce the verdict outside and the crowd cheers. And I'm like, what does it have to do with you? It's
That becomes an identity for them, I guess.
well, yeah, they have a vested interest in the outcome because they've been following it and they have their own opinions. I mean, it happened with the OJ case, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because Lizzie's on the AP, so it's broadcast worldwide and definitely in the United States. And OJ's on TV and radio live during the process. And so we're all listening to it and it goes on and on and on. And we all think we know what happened. And we all are hearing it, but not hearing all of it because no one could sit and hear all of it. So you're getting this by piecemeal, but listening to pieces of the trial. And then coming to a conclusion and then either being outraged or elated at the verdict. And it's such an odd thing for America to care so much about those kinds of things, to be
Well, it's a serial
entertainment.
drama. It's a
Yeah.
serial drama. It's just as novels in this era are serialized, sometimes in newspapers, often in magazines. This is the day-to-day exciting thing. This is the water cooler talk before there's water coolers,
Right.
that people want to know. What did you think of this? What did you think of that?
Yeah. And everybody's got an opinion. Why not? Why not? We do, right?
Yes, we do.
In a very kind of unfortunate and sort of disappointing sense, Elizabeth Jordan's autobiography, which I have a copy of, and it's signed by her. It's
Oh my goodness.
I know, I have a
I'm
signed
jealous
copy.
now.
Not that she signed it for me. I am not that old, but I
Still.
did buy a signed copy. 3 Rousing Cheers, which is an enjoyable read. I quickly went to the Borden case, chapter 8, Lizzie Borden and the murders. And I was like, okay, let's hear what Elizabeth Jordan says from a distance. And I was so shocked. She
Yes.
gets it entirely wrong. And since she was there, wouldn't she have access to her own reporting? I mean, how do you think she got it so wrong?
She misses a lot of details, or she's
It's
got them
opposite
completely
the fact.
wrong.
Yeah,
She's got the month wrong. She's got the time of day wrong.
Well, let me go through it.
Please.
She says that the crime was committed at 2:00 on a hot July afternoon in a house where all the windows were open at the time. She says Emma was the youngest daughter.
Mhm.
Lizzie was out in the barn brooding tenderly over a setting hen, which that day had suddenly declined to set.
That's very specific, isn't it?
Yes, thus
And
Miss
wrong.
Borden, she swore, was 100 feet from the house from 2:00 till 2:30. The old couple were dozing, his wife in a rocking chair upstairs, and he on his couch in the living room, and that both were murdered with an axe, and the furniture, walls, even ceilings were thickly clotted with blood. Lizzie was a teacher in the Fall River public school system and
Emma was
loved and
too.
respected. Yes, both of them were, but particularly Lizzie was loved and respected by her pupils. She walked out of the house and across the lawn to the home of her nearest neighbors to give the alarm. Let's see what else. Oh, she completely changes what she thought about Andrew in her reporting. In her reporting, she said he was not miserly with his family. Yet in her autobiography, she said he had been miserly and a marionette with his daughters, and that all they had were their small salaries as teachers, and he made them pay a large part of that as room and board. Wait, what? She had stripped to the skin to commit the murders, is one theory, and that they had saved and economized, the family had, the sisters, Lizzie and Emma, had saved and economized until they had enough money to go to Europe one summer the cheapest way,
Both of them.
completely negating the father paying for the grand tour. And they had kept to themselves on the voyage because they were rather low in their minds over the return to the grim atmosphere. And she says, I think I was the only woman reporter in the courtroom the day the old man's skull was put in evidence. And she says that it was put in evidence by the defense attorneys, which is not, it was by the prosecution. She calls Robinson Judge Robinson instead of Governor Robinson. And in the end, she and her sister moved to another town and Emma went insane.
Insane. I love that part.
She kept her in her new home until Emma died several years later. And Lizzie wouldn't let anybody come and see Emma. And that she outlived Emma by many years. And I'm like,
crazy.
Was she in the same courtroom?
It's amazing, isn't it? And it's stuff like that makes you think, wait a minute, oh, can I trust her if she says this? If she says all these other things, can I trust her on this thing?
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was she's insistent that the story she wrote, the short story she wrote, which seemed entirely identical to the Lizzie Borden case.
Or at least very similar.
Yes,
she
similarities. Swears that she wrote it before the Borden trial, but she swears this in this autobiography in the same chapter where she gets everything wrong. So isn't it possible, because it was released after the trial, the story that she wrote, isn't it possible that she's just trying to make it sound like she was prescient instead of taking a page from this real life event and writing a story about it? And what's wrong with that anyway?
It is entirely possible. And I do not know. I need to ask some friends of mine who have studied, spent a lot of time in the archives held at New York Public Library. I am not sure that we have manuscript copy or even correspondence related to that, her first short story, which is called Ruth Herrick's Assignments, a wonderful short story. She says it was submitted to Cosmopolitan in 1892. She covered the trial in 93, and it appears in summer of 1894. To me, that's a long wait to get a story published in terms of 19th century publishing. I mean, that's the kind of wait you have for academic articles today, right? It doesn't seem entirely plausible, but that's her story, right? That I didn't write this story, which is about a female journalist who doesn't find out a woman is guilty of, in this case, murdering her husband, and she chooses not to divulge that information. She returns to the story of a female journalist having kind of inside information in not divulging it, and then writing a story about it and sort of getting in trouble. And she adds to this story in a later story called The Case of Helen Brandau. And it's just a fascinating kind of twist in conjunction with her coverage of the Lizzie Borden case. I don't know. I cannot, at this point, I have no evidence that she did write it before or after. Either way, I think it's fascinating the way in her memoir written in 1938, she makes such incredible, changes to the story. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, maybe. One is age. She's in her 70s by then. This trial was 45 years earlier. She might have forgotten. I want to think, though, just on a more intellectual level, it speaks to how, kind of what we were talking about before, Lizzie Borden becomes so much more than the factual Lizzie Borden. She becomes this person, and the case becomes this thing that people can kind of, I'm going to use a terrible analogy here, but I'm thinking of a Mr. Potato Head. Like, we're going to put this kind of eyebrow on, or, we're going to add these features and that, change it up as you want. to make it fit a story that you like. So somewhere in her mind, she likes the story of Emma going insane and, they're having occupations. By the 1930s, women did have occupations. So she's not really reflecting maybe the late 19th century culture. It's almost like fitting rudimentary elements of the Borden story into kind of the zeitgeist of the 1930s, where we want to see it this way. We wanted to more excited. What would make a good movie? Oh, I know, the sister going insane.
Well, two things. If she wrote the story, the short story after the trial, and then got it published a year after, if that was the truth, and the story is about a journalist who has been given the information about the guilt of the accused, but she keeps it to herself, isn't that creating sort of a Nellie Bly-ness to her journalism, where that she says, oh, I'm not like you, but then she does this thing that's very much like her, where she becomes sort of the center of attention, and now everybody looks at her as somebody who Lizzie had talked to and probably gave a confession to, because she talks about people looked at me and said that Lizzie had confessed to me, and she's like, but I don't know when she would have had the time because I didn't see her privately. She's very strict in her autobiography to say, I didn't have any private meetings with her, that it was all what I saw in court. So she's sort of defending herself, again, her reputation of having leaked out this thought that Lizzie had confessed to her by writing this short story that matched so similarly matched the case. Not exactly like I said before, but that's one idea, that's why it evolves and it changes back, and it, and she has to defend herself in her final reputation, her autobiography.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of things to say about that. To my knowledge, we don't have a record of who actually talked to Lizzie after the acquittal. I know I'm not, you probably know better than I, but Julian Ralph writes about having met Lizzie Borden and having her thank him for his coverage.
Right.
So
she was reading it. Yes.
Right. So do we even know that, who else talked to her from the press, or at least had passing confirmation? I don't know. But the other thing is that I want to point out what makes Elizabeth Jordan such an interesting writer. There were other occasions where something she had written for the newspaper got translated into short story form. It got fictionalized. So she wrote a column, or at least helped contribute to a column called True Stories of the News in about 1889, 1890. And these were sort of human interest stories that ran daily, and they would kind of go a step beyond the who, what, where, when, why of, say, this person was found having committed suicide, or there's this family that was evicted. True Stories of the News was meant to dig a little further into the, usually pathetic human condition. Others were more humorous. It varied, but there was a lot of impoverished person here in this situation. And there's at least one story, probably more, that she wrote that then became what's called a newspaper fiction, a fiction written about a journalist doing something. This is a popular genre in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. So she had this propensity might be the wrong word. I don't know yet how often it happened, but she at least had a track record by the end of her career of taking a news story and then switching it up and making it into a fiction, sometimes in very, very clever ways. So I don't think we can rule out the possibility that she covered the trial first, then wrote the story, then it was published, and people were kind of
Yeah.
upset about it, suspicious.
And then
about
her
it.
autobiography is fiction. I mean,
Yes.
seriously, the story of the
It
trial,
could be.
the visualization of Lizzie going to the brooding hen in the where did that come from?
It's such a detailed list of things that have no bearing in her own reporting or anybody else's reporting.
Poor Emma, she's gone insane and she's
I
died. But
know.
all these people are dead now, so I guess it doesn't really matter. You know what you were saying about how Lizzie has become, almost doesn't matter about the facts. John Douglas, the FBI profiler, wrote a book. I think it was The Cases That Haunt Us, and he has a Lizzie Borden chapter because somebody asked him to profile her and to see if he could determine whether she was the killer from a profile he would work up on the murders themselves. And he got the facts wrong in the book about the murder. And I'm thinking, oh man, I'm depending on you here. You're the expert. You're the guy who's going to write the definitive.
Depressing.
Yeah. And you get the facts wrong. And then I thought, it really doesn't matter. Let me go to his conclusion, because his conclusion can still make sense, even if he got the facts wrong. And it was, I don't remember it being profound. I don't remember exactly, it didn't stay with me, let's put it that way. But even he didn't have someone to edit it and say, no, this is factually inaccurate. And so he used incorrect information to reach a profile.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, that's very typical, because isn't Elizabeth Jordan doing the same thing? She's profiling her.
Yeah.
It's profiling her for us.
I love that idea.
Yeah.
It happened in her own time, but if you think about all the production, cultural production that we've seen after the fact, all the films, all the TV series, there's Alfred Hitchcock show, there's Lizzie Borden Showdown, countless works of fiction and
ballet,
operas and ballets. That's what they're doing, right? They're all profiling Lizzie Borden.
Well, I never mind a work of theater. I'll use that, a work of theater, including television. I never mind TV, movies, or theater, or dramas, or ballet, or music, or opera, or any of those performing areas. I never mind them inventing anything, as long as within the context of the plot and of the story they're presenting, it is consistent. So if they want to invent an entirely new idea about what was going on and they change everything around, as long as it's consistent within and of itself, it will still reach a satisfying conclusion for me. So I have nothing negative to say about it. It's like their interpretation of.
Mm-hmm.
So that's okay with me. So I was in love with the television series, the Lizzie Borden Chronicles. I thought they were hilarious, and I thought it was grand guignol, and I thought it was, turning her into some kind of serial killer.
Yeah.
And it was absurd.
Yes.
And its absurdity appealed to me because it was witty. It had intelligence behind it, and there was tons of in-jokes. So I totally got all the little things that were going on in there. And so the rock opera Lizzie is a favorite of mine. I've become friends with all of the people involved in that script.
Wonderful.
Because it's so emotionally satisfying as an audience member, and they're completely making up their whole, world of Lizzie. But it works.
Mm-hmm.
So why not? Why not? As long as you're fictionalizing it, is what I'm saying. But a documentary, someone who's an historian or someone who is purporting to be a truth teller,
right,
like a journalist,
right,
I'd better get it right. And I think she got it right during the trial.
I do too.
I don't think there was anything in there that seemed outrageous, except her, verbosity about either this or that, and it can't be, anything else. The sort of grandiosity of her language, but it wasn't factually inaccurate.
It's consistent with, pretty much consistent with what everyone else is saying. The framing, as I've said, changes from reporter to reporter.
In your first book, Narrating the News, which I love the title, by the way.
Thank you.
It really is what the book is about. You touch on gender and the Borden case, and you hypothesize that this may have been one reason why Lizzie was acquitted. Not only what you mentioned before, class, social class, but you talked about gender. Can you expand on this just a little bit?
It was, of course, then as now, you don't see levels of violent crime amongst women at the rate that you do for men. And if you look at the news, as a journalism scholar, history of journalism scholar, you look at the way news coverage treats murder by women. If that happens, it's big news, right? If a guy kills somebody with an axe and a New York newspaper reports on it, that happens all the time, right? But if a woman does something violent, that's big news. The newspapers, I'm thinking of like New York, city newspapers in particular. You get all sorts of stories about, this woman killed her baby, or she lost her mind and stabbed her husband. Those are pretty common. You see those, but it's rare to find violent crime, violent murder associated with women. Poison, yeah, that happens, but violence. And so, sort of like with the social class thing, I mean, it works hand in hand.
Yeah.
It's an intersectionality. It's far more common for newspapers to report on impoverished women doing those things, or women who are, down in the Bowery or Five Points doing something violent. So you've got the intersection of her social class and her gender. She's a lady. She's not like that type of woman, who's loose with morals, or,
She was a Sunday school teacher, for goodness sake.
Right. Or a teacher, according to Elizabeth Jordan.
Public school teacher. Yeah.
Public school teacher. So I think partly because of the way jury members were probably socialized to think of women as not being capable of this sort of thing. It's certainly not that class of woman. That probably did have to play a factor in how they deliberated.
It almost feels like they looked at each other and went, they were in there 20 minutes and they're looking at each other going, anybody? Oh, okay, let's go. Like, they could have saved us 2 weeks of our time.
Yeah, exactly. I was on a jury like that once. It's like, really? We're just going to wait an hour to make it look decent, but dang, that's 2 weeks I could have back.
Yeah. Is it possible to know the Borden case without studying the journalism of the case? Since they were all there covering the case, and what we know of the story is filtered through their lenses, do you think our understanding and misunderstandings come from the same source? New journalism?
That's such a fascinating question. I think it's a fraught question, because if you don't approach the journalism with a healthy dose of, I don't want to say skepticism, but a healthy awareness that it's a construct, it's a narrative construct. We have parts of a news story that are going to be verifiable, such as a transcript of what happens. But the rest of it really is a journalist's attempt to make that fact stuff make sense to people. Because that's what narrative is.
Yes, it's selling papers. It's commercialization of the news.
Right. So some are going to be more sensationalistic in order to sell. Right. Others, like the writing of Julian Ralph, are going to be more thoughtful, but it's still a construction of Lizzie Borden that may or may not be fact-based, right? It's his attempt to help his audience understand what's going on here. Again, New England, old maid, Salem, going after innocent older women. And he, of course, gets stuff about Salem wrong, too, in his use of imagery. I don't know that it is possible to fully understand. I mean, certainly it's the richest body of information we have.
It's most entertaining part.
It is the most entertaining, but it's also the most treacherous in some way.
It is treacherous. That's a good word. It is a good word because it is treacherous. I tell people that all the time. You can't believe everything you read. And the reason why is because the local papers in particular printed gossip. So and so said, or so and so who didn't want to be named said, and you're like, wait, no, people are going to believe you. And to this day, people walk around with that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And letting Hiram Harrington, the brother-in-law of Andrew,
Mm-hmm.
have such an important, prominent, be an important character in the story in the early days
Mm-hmm.
through the Fall River newspapers, and his beef with Andrew being made public. And it seems so petty if you compare it to what he was actually complaining about. He was complaining about a water bill that was like $3.50.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but he makes it sound like it's this enormous thing that he put his wife through when their father died. And so he's given all this print space. And so people think, oh, he must be important. He must have some insight because he was there. He knows these people.
It's small town stuff. I
It
grew up
is
in a
small
small
town stuff.
town, and that's the sort of, it's a ruling factor. This faction of people says this, well, this more powerful faction says this, and whose voice is going to win out. But you can easily see how that might have played a role in how quickly Fall River, at least through the newspaper, turned against her, because certainly wasn't it just a year later or within months even that they started writing pretty negative things, and certainly on the anniversary.
Well, the Fall River Globe, the Fall River Daily Globe thought she was guilty. And Edwin Porter, who wrote for the Globe,
Right.
who wrote The Borden Tragedy,
Right.
he, while not saying she's guilty in his book, he doesn't say what he thinks at all in his book about anything. In fact, he's more reporter, like we think of today, in his book than he is in his writing in the newspaper.
Interesting.
It's just a sort of factual retelling of what happened. And it's not the whole story, where the other newspapers were behind her. So the Globe was the one that not every year, but almost every year, published a anniversary issue on the day of the murders, in August 4th, to remind the town that she got away with it, in a way, to bring it up again. And she would spend that time, according to Parallel Lives by the Fall River Historical Society, she would spend that time in Washington, D.C. or somewhere else. She took the August vacation.
Understandably so.
To get out of Dodge while this stuff was going on, while it worked everybody up again. She just went off and had her life, and because it was always going to be like that.
Must have been horrible, really.
Can you imagine?
Regardless of, I don't know.
I know it's hard to say that, because if she did it, then
exactly.
Yes, she deserves the tortures of the damned.
Exactly. And don't ask me who I think did it.
No, me neither. I don't want to know, because I can't be specifically right. So there's no way for me to tell you that we all have our beliefs, but it's a thought. It's not a provable thing. And no wonder she was acquitted, right?
Yeah. And at this point in history, aside from, yes, people were murdered, it really doesn't, to me, that's not the story anymore of who did it. To me, as a scholar, at least, the story is what happened afterward and how has it changed over time. That's
just to look at how people wrote about her and how they framed her, as you say. I think that's a new way of looking, or a continuous way of looking at it, that's important. Because because we can't use our 21st century eyes and go back, because they got all the science. They didn't have the science that we have. And so because they don't have the forensic technology, they did what they could with what they had, and it wasn't enough to convict anybody. So they were caught short, completely caught short in this case, because if they had modern forensics and fingerprinting even, which came not too long after, it might make a difference. But everybody trooped in. The crime scene was not cordoned off. Reporters were walking around the house. There were 7 doctors in and out of the house. They were examining the bodies and the wounds and moving them. And I mean, it was a mess. It was a
Yes.
total mess. And you think of disturbing a crime scene today and that being so sacrilegious, and how people can get acquitted before the first speech by the first lawyer. The case can get thrown out because the evidence is compromised, and all the evidence was compromised in this case. So there's no way she should have ever been, by our modern standards. But then if you go back in time and you look at it from 19th century standards, it's a completely different way of looking at the case. And so when Elizabeth Jordan goes on and on about what she was wearing, that's what her readers cared about.
Yeah.
And she plugged into that. And because she did that, we have these amazing descriptions.
Yeah. She was a very astute writer in terms of what does my audience want? What matters? And again, she wasn't a sensationalist writer.
Right.
She had a hard feeling about especially female journalists who only went for sensation in a way that was harmful and thoughtless. So she was doing her best, I think, to give people what they needed to know, what she thought they needed to know, to try to reach their own best conclusions.
It's interesting that many of these women journalists and many of these other journalists were also fiction writers. I thought that
Yes.
the combination and the way you tell that in your book about both books, about the crossing paths of fiction and journalism, and how they honed their talents in their fiction and then transferred them to the human interest narratives that they told in the newspapers.
And back and forth. It wasn't a one way, an old model used to be, well, people like Stephen Crane or William Dean Howells, they were journalists, and that was practice for the important work, writing fiction. And, that's something I try to disrupt. It was a symbiotic relationship that is far more complex than that.
And they were good writers. I mean, they
Yes.
were nothing else. They were really good writers. And so they're entertaining to the nth degree. It's accessible.
Yes, absolutely. I think journalists,
Maybe that's
today-
people lean on the journalists as opposed to the trial transcripts.
Yeah, maybe so.
The dry primary sources, as opposed to these rich, vivid descriptions of what these journalists were experiencing and who they talked to.
I think so. Of the countless newspaper articles that I've read, when it gets into that transcript stuff, and usually it goes into a smaller typeface, like, oh, boy, skip that. I know that. Let's get to the good stuff.
It's like skipping block quotes in a book.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, I don't have to read that. I don't.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just a big quote. Okay. Yeah, you and I both know about that. The
Yes,
dangers
we
of
do.
block quotes. Yeah. Well, what are you working on now? Any new books on the horizon, or have you moved off the subject and you're on to something else?
Well, for now, I'm putting a pause on Lizzie Borden, though I have a whole shelf of some primary source materials, I don't have any signed copies of, not like others I know, but I have a whole bunch of pieces of literature that feature Lizzie Borden. Someday I might get to that Lizzie Borden book that I referred to. But for now, I'm working on some digital humanities projects, including one about Elizabeth Jordan, who is finally getting a biography. She was an incredible woman, an incredible journalist, newspaper writer, but also an editor for many, many years at Harper's Bazaar. She shepherded in many important authors like Sinclair Lewis, and had great ideas about alternative literary forms like a composite novel. She was also a suffragist and did other works of art. So I'm working with a couple of colleagues who are doing a critical reader of Jordan's work, and we're starting a digital project about her.
But you're not doing the biography? Someone else is doing the biography?
Well, that'll be included in the digital.
Oh.
Well, yeah, I'm not writing the biography. No,
Oh,
I'm not
okay.
writing the biography. I had thoughts of doing that many years ago with another colleague, and then life got in the way. And that's the
Because
sort of thing.
I can't get enough of Elizabeth Jordan. I think that
Yeah.
she almost an enigma, but not, because she's all out there with herself. She seems to be out there, but she's so cutting edge to me.
She
So
really was. She did incredible work. And it's only been in the last couple of decades, I would say, 20, 30 years, which in my lifespan, that seems like, oh, that's recent. That people have started, at least in scholarly circles, have started writing about her. And I'm glad that she's finally getting her due.
That's good. That's excellent. That's really good to hear. Well, I want to thank you so very much for coming today and being a part of this conversation.
It was my honor.
Brilliant, and what you have to say is so important. And I recommend people, you can actually get Kindle versions of these books if you'd like to read them on which are slightly less expensive. Narrating the News, and the other book is Sympathy, Madness, and Crime. And they're both very accessible reads of scholarship, which is hard to do. They're not full of jargon.
I tried to keep them,
yes, you can read them.
Academic, but accessible.
Exactly, they are. You have succeeded. I like them both. And unfortunately, none of them are signed by you. So we'll have to take care of that. I'll have to send them to you and you can sign them and send them back. But anyway, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's been a long time coming for us to meet, I think, because I've heard of you since you wrote your book, what, in 2004?
The first was 2005, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, I heard of you then, which that was a while ago. So
that was a while ago.
that was a while ago for millennials.
Yes.
Another generation. So I'm really glad that we had this opportunity.
I thank you so much. It was a pleasure, just a delight.
Thank you.
Get back into her work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, Episode 19. We've been talking to Karen Roggenkamp, author of 2 books on 19th century journalism, which both highlight the Lizzie Borden case and offer a very interesting take on the way the trial was covered in the press. Find Richard Barron's Lizzie Borden Girl Detective stories at Amazon.com and at LizzieBordenGirlDetective.com, where you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Listen to more Lizzie Borden podcasts on our website or on Podbean, Audible, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube. If you like what you're hearing, please consider supporting this podcast by subscribing to it on Patreon.com.